We are amazingly grateful to Professor Helen Lockheed for agreeing to deliver this lecture. Professor Lockheed is the Dean of the School of Built Environment at the University of New South Wales. And as we speak, the University of New South Wales and TERI, along with other partners, is hosting the 10th GRIHAS Summit, which is about to get over, and I'm hoping that we will see inflow of people as that gets over. Let me also introduce our chair, Professor Jagan Shah, who is the director of the National Institute of Urban Affairs, and I can't think of a better chair and speaker combination than we have, talking about sustainable cities on one hand, and with Professor Jagan Shah's experience on moving India ahead on the smart cities movement on the other hand. I should also mention that the Science, Technology and Innovation Policy Forum is now about a year and a quarter old. We had the first lecture on the 26th of September 2017 when Dr. R. Chidambaram, the principal scientific advisor, delivered the first lecture. The next lecture in January, on the 10th of January, would be on science movements in India. I look forward to seeing you there as well. But without further ado, let me hand it over to Professor Jagan Shah and to Professor Lockheed for today's Science, Technology and Innovation Policy Forum lecture. Jagan, all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur, and thank you all for joining us for this lecture. As you know, this is the 15th in a long series of lectures by extremely distinguished speakers, all related to the myriad aspects of science and technology in India. And we are extremely happy that Professor Dr. Helen Lockheed has joined us today for delivering the 15th lecture. I just thought I'd preface the introduction of Professor Lockheed with a few thoughts about what I consider to be the great significance of today's lecture, not only because she's an architect and I'm an architect as well, not just that camaraderie, but more than anything else, the fact that, of course, the context is today's conference or this week's conference by TERI, which is a landmark event every year for everybody interested in sustainability broadly. But as you know, we've just more or less concluded or barely recovered from what has happened in Poland over the last few days, and everybody is talking about really the rising crisis, one might say, of dealing with the impacts on climate change, of development in general, but clearly urban development playing a very significant role in that. And I thought it's important. I like the fact that the title of the talk is Towards More Sustainable Cities. It's not all done and dusted. We haven't achieved sustainable cities yet. And we need to talk about pathways to actually achieve that. And I do hope that Professor Lockheed's presentation will engage us with the whole idea of choosing particular pathways, because we need to move fast and we need to move wide. I mean, we need speed and we need scale in order to achieve any of our goals, say by 2030, which is one of our target years. And for this, we need to unlock ourselves from current business as usual development paradigms. We need to measure the co-benefits we can actually have from making interventions in the urban sector is so complex. You could enter it from any particular trajectory, but science and technology is clearly one of the key entry points for smart cities as well as all sustainable settlements. And clearly we need to develop partnerships. Dr. Mathur was just saying that it's important for us to develop partnerships coming out of these kinds of meetings. But clearly that's the only way forward, because there is no way that governments alone can deal with the complexity and scale of what we have to deal with. And key to that developing of partnerships, the unlocking, the measuring of co-benefits is planning and design. Clearly sustainability has to be achieved by design. It cannot be an accident, and of course we'd be extremely fortunate if it was an accident, but as it turns out, what is by accident is damage being done to the climate and to our living environment. So planning and design becomes central to this, and that's why it's really important that we have today. I noticed there haven't been too many lectures from this particular perspective, and I think it's wonderful that we are starting with with this. I hope it's a trend that we engage more and more with architecture and urban planning. But it's important that we have today's lecture. So let me share with you briefly the introduction to Professor Helen Lockheed, who is an accomplished Australian architect, urban and landscape designer. I think it bears reading, if you don't mind that I read this. You may have seen the flyer, but it's important to remind ourselves of how accomplished our speaker is in this domain. She, prior to being the Dean of the Faculty of Built Environment at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, she has held a number of influential positions in the New South Wales government and in the city of Sydney. And that's, I think, important. She brings the experience of actually having worked as a government architect as well. And that's really wonderful, because there aren't too many such cases. And in India, we also are starved of such experience coming in. I'd like to point out that Professor Lockheed has, of course, won many accomplishments, a number of awards. I won't read out each of those, and there are many. Importantly, that she has bridged across national boundaries as well, that she's worked and studied in Sydney as well as in the United States at Columbia University, and has been bridging between professional practice, education, and scholarship. So we could not have asked for a better speaker for this evening's lecture. And may I now invite Professor Helen Lockheed to deliver the lecture.
Thank you for that great introduction, and I'm very pleased to be here with you today. I've had a great couple of days being involved in the GRIHA Summit. We're actually been delighted to be able to collaborate on this with the University of New South Wales and GRIHA, and we hope it'll be a long and happy relationship. So tonight I'm going to be talking about towards a more sustainable city. I'm actually using Sydney as a case study rather than all cities everywhere, because I think it's always good to talk to your area of expertise, and Sydney is my laboratory. I've worked there for most of my professional life in private practice, for government, and now as an academic, and so I feel like I span the inside and the outside, the private sector and the public sector, and as well as a citizen, and understand the city intimately. Most of you who have actually been to Sydney, or actually, can we turn the lights down a little bit? Is that possible, or not so much? If you have been to Sydney, it is one of the most beautiful cities in the world and is highly renowned for that. But in fact, it's considered to be a harbour city. It's a city of 5 million people, but really the harbour is just a very small fraction. The harbour city is a very small fraction of a very vast, sprawling metropolis. Unfortunately, over time, that sprawling metropolis has been planned in a way which is unsustainable. And we, like Indian cities, are growing at a rapid pace. By 2050, our city will have increased by 80% to a city of 8 million people. And with that growth come unexpected and unanticipated consequences. One of the most distinct consequences is the spatial inequality that has arisen through the rise of suburban disadvantage. If you look at this map prepared by our City Futures Research Centre, you can see the marked difference between the haves and the have-nots. If you're on the red side of this line, you have opportunity, economic, educational, health, and otherwise. On the blue side, it's the opposite. It's entrenched disadvantage in terms of lack of opportunity and many, many other impacts that go with it. The suburbanisation of Sydney has resulted in suburban sprawl, low amenity, inadequate infrastructure planning, and in fact car dependency. And with that suburbanisation has come a raft of other impacts. Air pollution, which you're familiar with in New Delhi, increased urban flooding because of the paving and the amount of hard areas. With that also comes exacerbated heat island impacts and dependence on air conditioning, and of course a rise in chronic disease, asthma, diabetes, and the like. In the inner city, it's not so much better. While we have increased gentrification, we also have redundant industrial lands which need to be refurbished, an aging infrastructure that needs to be replaced. And with the rise of gentrification, you also have homelessness. So we have many urban challenges, just like India. And this is only going to grow in the next 20 to 30 years. With these urban challenges, we have environmental degradation that needs to be managed. We have climate challenges, as we all know, with the rapid heat increases in Sydney and the same in India. We are going to get temperatures, above the average of 5 to 10 degrees. What is that going to mean to human health? And extreme weather events. This has economic consequences as much as anything in terms of access to employment and cost of living. And of course, the social disadvantage that I talked about, as well as chronic health impacts. So with these multiple challenges, business as usual is not an option. We have to think about how and we are going to do things differently. But of course, with an imperative comes opportunity and comes innovation, the opportunity to do things differently. When we look at Australia, over 90% of the Australian population live in cities today. And as we know, cities are one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're going to tackle the problem of climate change, and we need to tackle the challenges of urbanisation. Interestingly, in a city like Sydney, more than 60% of the built environment that will exist in 2050 already exists today. In some parts of the city, it's over 80%. You can see this trend also in established cities like New York or London or very established urban cores. Conversely, only 25% of the infrastructure that we will need in 2050 exists. And so we'll need to build integrated infrastructure at a rapid pace to meet the demand in the next 30 years. So my thesis is urban regeneration and new green and integrated infrastructure are fundamental to more sustainable, resilient cities. So what does that mean? It means they're infrastructure that is multi-purpose, that it serves multiple functions. It means retrofitting existing buildings and not just deleting and replacing and rebuilding, but reusing, repurposing, and retrofitting. It means multi-pronged approaches, that many strategies and projects working together. We have to think about policies, planning the city scale, as well as delivering projects and all together. And so we need to be working at multiple scales, small interventions as well as broad strategic strategies. And if we do this in a systemic and integrated way, the whole will be much more than the sum of the parts. I always like to say that 1 + 1 should equal 5. So how are we doing that in Sydney? I'd like to say that the best kind of policy is informed by robust evidence-based research, and that is really what underpins the metropolitan strategy for the city of Sydney, and also at a more fine-grained scale, the implementation of projects which are greener and more sustainable at a precinct level and in the places within them. So let's just talk about that one by one. Research in our faculty is very much focused on shaping future cities, cities that are resilient, informed, healthy, smart, connected, green, livable, and inclusive. To do this, we actually focused on some thematic research areas. One, the environment. How do we improve and make a more sustainable built environment? And secondly, how do we design for humans foremost in mind, so that the benefits of human-centric design and designing for sustainability are integrated and more than the sum of the parts. We also are very much aware of the importance of new and emerging technologies, big data, to inform our decision making, but also in unpacking the analytics. So this is a kind of a diagram of our research agenda, and let me just tell you about some of the work that we're doing. The CRC, or the Cooperative Research Centre for Low Carbon Living, is very much focused on reducing carbon emissions in the built environment, with a raft of initiatives and multi-sector partnerships across government, public-private partnerships, and multiple universities at a national level. There have been hundreds of research projects that have been delivered in conjunction with industry to have real-world impact. One of the most significant, I would say, is the idea of living labs, of real places in the cities where test beds can be monitored. Some of them have been exhibited here today, like at Josh's house over in the Habitat Centre, where it's continually monitoring and providing a feedback loop as to how to do things better in a more sustainable house to inform better decision making. An offshoot of that is our high performance built environments cluster, with being led by Professor Matt Santamouris, who's very much engaged in looking at the impacts of heat island in cities at a metropolitan level. He's done the largest global investigation into Darwin of the whole city, and is very much focused on Western Sydney and working with the Parramatta City Council and instituting a living lab there of a complete street to monitor it over a 5-year period, to look at how new technologies, including new materials, greening, water, and sensors that provide feedback loops, can really develop cooler urban environments. And our City Futures Research Centre, which is very much focused on using city analytics and city well-being as key areas of research. One example is the City Analytics Lab, led by Professor Chris Pettit, who is also here over the last couple of days. And this particular study is looking at urban mobility and mapping where people move, how they move, and how we can actually engender more active forms of transport. And ultimately, the goal of this is more healthy and sustainable built environments. So user-centric behaviour and looking at that data to actually change people's lives for the better in terms of the design, planning and policy within the built environment are key to the work of Professor Susan Thompson and others in that cluster. So what does that mean for a city like Sydney? We know that the daily summer temperatures are increasing, and that by 2050 it will be much hotter. In response to this, we need to do something different in the built environment. We need to address the design of the built environment to make it cooler, to improve human health as well as sustain environmental health. So some of the strategies that have been looked at through this research are cool roofs, cool walls, cool pavements, cool streets, cool canopies, as well as water and heat mitigating materials. The research done by Matt Santamouris' group has noted that in using an integrated raft of mitigation strategies in Western Sydney, the energy demand will be reduced by up to 50%, and heat-related morbidity can be reduced by 35 to 40%. The impacts of this research are huge. But what does that mean on the ground for designers and policymakers like me? The first thing is the strategy for the city. The city is really seen as 3 cities: the harbour city, the river city, and the parkland city. And if you note those descriptors, it's very much designed around the thematic of the environment that actually supports the urban context. The Metrostrategy, therefore, is in planning a growing city, is focused on how we build a strong global city founded around these three key nodes. It's very much focused on developing policies which are about delivering sustainability, not just for the environment, but also in terms of social sustainability and economic development. And to do this, there are a number of goals, and I'll just talk about a few of them. The first one, of course, is world-class services and transport to ensure that we break down the inequity between the East and the West and expand our infrastructure to service those areas in the West, not only rapid transit, but active transport as well. That means delivering more density around centres with more services and creating more opportunity for jobs close to home. And these centres in the western part of the city, now with better services, better transport, are greener, more active, and more connected to the neighbourhoods around them. So the third strategy is about a great place to live, with communities that are strong, healthy, and well connected. So that means retrofitting and revitalising those existing suburbs, those ones which seem to be bleak and disconnected, by making them more connected through multipurpose open and green spaces that can support physical activity. And some of these spaces are very much but actually connecting through the waterway systems and those green corridors that exist, which are knitted within the suburban communities, and can support cycle networks as well as walking. And the fourth goal is really about supporting a sustainable and resilient city that protects the natural environment and balances land use and resources. And that does not just mean forests and natural ecosystems, but it also means agricultural land and biodiversity, so that we build resilience into natural hazards and weather impacts. And that sometimes means restoring natural ecosystems, dismantling stormwater culverts and replacing them with more natural systems. The one here on the right is actually an old stormwater culvert. It's actually been dechannelized to restore those ecosystems and also to improve flood management. So as part of the policy framework, there are a raft of supporting documents, and this one is the Green Infrastructure Strategy, called Greener Places. And within it, it talks about the ways to actually improve green infrastructure and build green infrastructure into the city at the micro level. And that is very much about connectivity, integration, and improvement to the urban environment. The Sydney Green Grid is a project that we did when I was working in government to create a green network to enhance resilience and livability. We did this again in Parramatta, which is Sydney's western or river city, to document the spatial inequity in access to open space. And as you can see in this mapping that we undertook at the time, there are very many large areas that are in great distances from any parkland or green open spaces or playgrounds for children. So in terms of retrofitting the city, it wasn't possible to create new parks everywhere, but what we could do was actually connect the dots. And how we did that was building on the waterways, and I keep on saying building, but I don't mean building, but actually using the waterways as a connector, as a conduit, and also for making connections of open space along that green network to mitigate flood risk, and also to improve cycling and walking. And so this was the outcome of that study, a new green connected network, which then we were able to scale up at the metropolitan level. And the Sydney Green Grid is now a big metropolitan green strategy for the city, Sydney, at a metropolitan level. And so this is how it lands on the ground, through green corridors, through parks, through stormwater harvesting, through public transport infrastructure connected to that, as well as public spaces, cycleways and pedestrian paths along the green streets. And from that, we developed another initiative called Design Parramatta, which was at, again, a micro level to look at ways these policies can land on the ground. And here is one example that we did in our office of connecting at, you can see, a small example of this green grid connection of connecting the dots right through to the river and the waterways. And here it is on the ground, and this project has now been implemented. So what we see through this little example is a strategic level at a metropolitan scale, informing policy about green infrastructure, informing the design of places at the local level. So all of these strategies working together, hand in hand. And some of these other precincts that I have been involved in use this in a different way. So Victoria Park was an old industrial site, flood-prone land, and so the idea, and now redundant, and so the idea was to do water-sensitive urban renewal. As you can see, it was a previous swamp in its former life before industrial development took place, and as you can imagine, it was a place of industrial development because it wasn't suitable for any other use. But over time, land value meant that it was wanting to be developed. And so the strategy for the urban development of this precinct was very much based on stormwater management and making cleaner, reusable water, which could be used not only in the parks and open spaces, but also in the water features, and also reticulated in the grey water used in toilets and the like in the development. So here you can see the plan of the streets, and we developed a proprietary item called leaky gutters. You can see the leaky gutters here, where the water from the road actually drains into these swales and therefore is naturally filtered before it goes into the water, water bodies in the parks. So again, not putting polluted water into the waterways, but actually cleaning it before it gets to the waterways. And that water is then able to be reused in water elements, which is all using recycled water from stormwater management. And the park that you see adjacent to this water feature is, in times of flooding, a large detention basin. So it becomes multifunctional. At times of dry, it's a park. In times of wet, it prevents stormwater flooding the urban areas. And of course, with that was planned very high quality housing, which also uses recycled water, and water management, as well as high quality housing. So a win-win-win in terms of meeting the larger government agendas of high density living in quality urban environments. Another project that I was involved in was the design of Sydney Olympic Park, a model sustainable urban centre and parkland. As you probably know, Sydney Olympic Park was designed and won as the greenest games ever in the year 2000, but it was very much focused on the delivery of a major events precinct. I was engaged after that to develop a post-Olympic strategy for a new part of Sydney, which was a 24/7 mixed-use precinct. But it was built on very good fundamentals. Again, it was not just about building new on green field sites, it was about retrofitting and regenerating damaged land within the urban footprint. And here we have one of the most polluted and toxic areas in Sydney, an area which was formerly wetlands and where the area had been reclaimed for development, where there were brickworks and as well as gasworks, and a great deal of toxicity over many years. The plan for the Olympic development was really about remediating that land and turning it into the largest urban parkland in Australia. Stormwater drains like this were dechannelized to create the one on the bottom, which is much more in keeping with the original waterways in that precinct of low-lying mangrove-lined creeks. As well as new parklands were developed, and this particular parkland was developed when I was the Director of Sustainable Development at Sydney Olympic Park. And of course, the largest solar-powered suburb in actually, I think it was globally actually when this was built, but probably not now. So new waterways, new solar-powered dwellings, all water recycling and management, including sewerage, is used on site and in the water features. A very green, sustainable development. We took the lessons from that period, and in the post-Olympic master plan, which I was responsible for, we increased the density, diversified the mixed use, and were able to maintain 6 green stars in terms of LEED, if you know the LEED ratings, in new development. And the way we were able to achieve 6 green stars was essentially because we were leveraging the embedded value of the site already. The green infrastructure that had already been established for the Olympic site, where we had cleaner water, new public transport, parklands, cycling, water recycling. All of this actually added to the ability of developers to leverage that opportunity to take it to 6 green stars. So a win-win-win-win. And within those precincts, one can design places which are also more sustainable. In the waterfront, in this inner harbour, I've been involved in the remediation and the design of many urban foreshores that have been revitalised. Again, most of these are post-industrial sites which are maybe been improved for parkland, but also this is an old former gasworks at Ballast Point, now a new urban park, and also places which have mixed-use development as well. But this is Barangaroo Headland Park, where the foreshore was actually taken back to closer to its original condition. But the focus of Sydney's development is really on the periphery. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, much of it has already been developed and it's not all good. So we need to retrofit the periphery to create more amenity and purposeful development. So this project that we undertook when I was at the government was to actually look at how we could improve the quality of the open space in the periphery. And that was very much about 4 principles: retrofitting the town centres in line with the Metrostrategy, connecting town centres through the green grid, enhancing the local open spaces, and finally creating purposeful regional green corridors. And I'll just talk about that in a little bit more detail. So much of the open space in the West is unpurposeful. It's costly and it's underused and profligate use of space. It's the verges left over from freeways. It's the in-between spaces. It's the space along the drainage corridor. Rather than leaving the creek and turning it into an amenity, it's become a drain. So it's the leftover space. It costs the local government a lot of money to maintain that space. It's often a place where rubbish is dumped, probably just like here in India. So how could we turn that liability back into an asset? We looked at ways of using that open space. So the first one was really about restoring degraded waterways to make them into more effective water bodies where we could restore ecologies. And here you can see one example of a stormwater channel which was actually reinstated. And then the middle stage was a public art project we did with the local community, where we planted grasslands, the native grasslands, on the original alignment of the creek, and showed how this drain on one alignment could be replaced with another restored creek on the original alignment. And you can see on the far right the example of how that project was delivered on the ground. Again, these places not only improve the local amenity, the local ecology, but they also improve the flood mitigation of these areas as well, which was the reason for putting in the drain in the first place. So we not only restore the ecologies. I think I just went backwards the wrong way. Oh no, yeah, I'm going the wrong way now. Sorry. Oh, I'm stuck. Oh no. Another one was looking at forest plantations or reforestation. So again, if we're talking about sustainability, we need to have sustainable materials as well. So the idea of sustainable forests is very much front and center in sustainable product procurement in the architecture and building industries. So why not use some of these open spaces for sustainable forestry? Another one was urban agriculture. In allowing this urban sprawl on Sydney's food bowl, we have lost a lot of food productivity close to urban areas where people live. And so again, a lot of this land is being identified for micro farming as well. And finally, there is a lot of development which backs onto these green corridors, whether they're drainage corridors or easements. And the idea here was to actually increase density and turn those green spaces into amenity and reorient the edges to the parkland. So instead of having backyards facing onto drainage corridors, we looked at taking the culverts away and restoring the waters and making new development along those waterways and along that parkland with active and connected cycleways and pathways, which turned a liability into an asset. So the point of my talk is this, that with very robust evidence-based research which informs our policies, one can design and plan a city where the precincts are sustainable and the places within them are also sustainable. And that way we can hit the target, but only by all of these strategies working together. So it's not about doing one singular project or one single action. It's about making them work together, and that way we can have multiplier effects. And that will make our cities more livable, more sustainable, and more equitable. And that's when we can achieve real impact. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very stimulating and engaging and sort of power-packed, I would say, in terms of ideas and solutions. Can I invite Dr. Mathur to maybe share some thoughts? I saw that you were looking at the presentation very
well.
Yeah.
You know, Helen, many thanks. This, as Jagan said, forced a lot of thinking. But at the heart of it, it would be great if you could share with us a little bit of the politics of how this was achieved as well. In particular, population pressure. You talked about how you were able to make areas more dense. Was there political opposition? Second, urban land is very valuable, and everybody wants a piece of it, including the politicians, your local councillors, and so on. How was that resolved?
Yeah. You know, they're very good questions. Politics and the city go hand in hand. And in Sydney, it's no different to any other major city where the land values are increasing. So the contestation for space is extremely high, where developers want to maximize, and the city wants to make sure we maintain the values and the amenity of the places as they are today, or the community does. But at the end of the day, the state government that controls metropolitan level Sydney knows that we have to increase housing, we need to increase density because the population is growing. And if we don't plan for it, it will happen anyway. It happens in an ad hoc way. So one of the key things that has been done in recent years is the development of the Greater Sydney Commission, which is a metropolitan-wide planning authority that has the power to integrate across agencies, and that has been a game changer in terms of strategic metropolitan planning. But before that, it was very much reactive of local government versus state government, regional objectives versus local objectives, and that tension. So the Greater Sydney Commission has really changed the face of metropolitan planning.
What kind of teeth does it have?
It has the greatest power it has. It makes the plans, but it also has the power to integrate across authorities. So it sits within the Premier's department, which is the peak body, the peak power, and so the Chief Commissioner answers to the Premier of the state. So it's not within the planning department.
Right.
It goes right above the planning department, and then the plans are then fed down to the planning department, to the transport department, to the water and infrastructure, and all those services to implement. So that's how that
do the mayors react to it?
Well, there was a great deal of consultation and working together, and the district plans, they have district commissioners, and those district commissioners work and represent the interests of those districts, but they also answer to the chief commissioner, so they have these dual reporting lines. And there's also an environment commissioner, a social commissioner, and an economic commissioner, so that it's very much about having a stitched up holistic approach to the planning of the city.
Thanks for asking that question, Dr. Mathur, because really that's at the fundament of our challenge, which is this, what we refer to as the multiplicity of authorities, each with a veto power and everybody else's decision making. So this sounds a little like the Regional Planning Association as well, that made the New York planning, which is a society, you know, and has been mandated with actually creating that integration and has a sort of autonomy, which is amazing.
I'm wondering whether the NCR Planning Board can be made more effective.
If only. Indeed, if only. But
we have a National Capital Region Planning Board for Delhi and its surrounding areas.
Does it cover the whole metropolitan area?
Oh, indeed, beyond that as well. It's more than 35,000 square kilometers of a region, which is going to be one of the most populous urban regions in the world.
It sounds like you've got a governance framework already.
Well, it's ended up as more of a coordination rather than anything else, you know. So it doesn't have teeth, as Dr. Mathur said. But I just wanted to address a question before we actually open it to the floor. So at the heart of all of this is land use. And we have a paradigm of planning which we are trying to break out of now. And in fact, my institute has been asked to develop the next master plan for Delhi, where we are shifting away from the segregated land use paradigm to adopting a more evolved paradigm about land use. But I just really wanted to address this question to you. How was that paradigm shift made? And I'm sure that you must have had a similar kind of planning paradigm where you were zoning and segregating land uses. How was that broken? Again, similar to the question Dr. Mathur asked, how did you make that transition? You know, what kind of policies or regulatory frameworks were put in place so that...
Or political economy.
Or political economy.
We definitely still have that, so don't it's not all rosy, I would have to say. However, you know, some of these are chicken and egg, because sometimes, you know, there were areas in some of these urban renewal areas around Victoria Park, which I showed, where, you know, we were looking at mixed use, but the market said residential, or we were looking at residential, and then the market said commercial. So even though it was mixed use, it wasn't actually mixing the uses. It was just having residential over here. It was a de facto way of zoning, because that's what the market responded to. It's only now in the Green Square area that we're actually seeing a maturing of the market to understand the value of a genuine mix of uses in precincts. But that's taken about, I'm talking about urban retrofit, but that's taken about 10 or 15 years to move from the market doing what it always knew.
I'm glad that you're also using the word market, which we seldom talk about market.
We're a little concerned about, though, Jagan, I mean, again, at the expense of hogging the conversation, what we have seen in Delhi is that mixed land use occurs. So you have a residential area, and then you have some houses which start housing doctors' practices, and then they start housing lawyers' chambers, and then they start housing IT infrastructure. And then along comes a few shops which sell amenities for people who live around, milk and bread, and then it grows. So one of the things that, you know, and then there's a master plan which says this is a residential area, and then the city and the courts periodically say this is a residential area. All of this non-residential use should be, to use the word that we use here, sealed. And then the sealing gives great pains to everybody. Is there a similar bottoms-up growth of mixed land use in Sydney?
Oh, definitely. But I do think probably, you know, if, for example, you had a small industrial use in a residential area, that would probably be shut down, right? But if it is, something which is less, more innocuous, the zoning is much more fluid in terms of what's acceptable and what, it's more like what are the environmental impacts, what are the social impacts, and these are measured in a way which is reasonable. Yeah.
I think what Helen mentioned about the chicken and egg situation, Dr. Mathur, is going to play out even in our context. I mean, we're not going to get the political economy, say for Delhi, completely sorted out before we can reform the planning frameworks. But we find a sort of entry point with policies such as transit-oriented development, where we've just framed the policy where we're going to pick up on priority 19 nodes which are high impact and high footfall sort of nodes, and that will allow us to shape neighborhoods around those nodes, which are, again, in fact, we're referring to Australian case studies as well, which you've done a lot of, which is taking metro stations and then redoing the precincts around that. But one of the peculiar oddities about our planning framework is that it actually stipulates what you can do rather than defining what you can't do. So, it'll tell you that in a residential neighborhood, there should be people living in houses and children playing in tot lots. But it won't tell you that there should not be, these many parking lots everywhere. So there's no negative list. We actually prescribe a positive list. And the ceiling of all these establishments is coming from that. That, well, we said you could only do this in the, economic activity, and you're not. Rather than enabling and just saying, well, no externalities. But having said that, I think this debate can go on, and we do look forward to more conversations on this for the benefit of Delhi. But I think it's important. I'm sure the audience is full of questions. So perhaps if we can take maybe 2 or 3 questions to start with, and perhaps Professor Lockheed can address those to start with. Yeah, please.
As you know, sustainability also includes the economic and the social impact. So could you take an example of one of the projects and how economic and social realities, like for example the housing price index or any of the other things, how long did they reflect the change in the transformation of the space, and in what way and in what timelines did those kick in to make the argument for some of the innovations you made with respect to land use?
Well, I mean, I should point out that most of the examples that I used are government-sponsored projects. So there is a public benefit, public policy imperative there. But I think the post-Olympic master plan that I worked on is a very good example of showing the value, the economic value of embedding sustainability measures in a precinct, and then being able to leverage it for the development, for the benefit of development. So, for example, because of the investment by the state in the Olympic site to make it a green Olympics, that green infrastructure from water to energy, from recycled water, black and grey water, solar power, new public transport connection, rapid transit, green infrastructure in terms of regenerating the waterways, and green infrastructure in terms of the parklands and cycleways, that had huge value in terms of value capture and uplift to that urban area. So then post-Olympics, then you can actually leverage that by the sites that you sell off to private development in the post-Olympic master plan are worth way more than they would ever have been before. And then not only that, then we could actually write policy and development controls which demanded 6 green stars. And the board of the Sydney Olympic Park Authority said, oh, we can't do that. And I was going like, well, this is what we should be building on the Olympics. We should be continuing to build on it. And I had economic modelling done of it. And, they said, all of this green infrastructure, whether it's water or transport or whatever, adds this much to the land value, and you should be able to leverage that because the developer's not actually investing in a 6 green star development. They're only investing in a 3 or 4 green star development because they're already capturing the 3 stars which are already embedded in the site. So that's an example of actually being able to leverage and actually value capture and leveraging that embedded investment for the next phase of development. And so there's a kick-on effect.
Yeah.
So this was some kind of hedonistic price modeling? I mean, what kind of economic modeling was this?
We was basically looking at what is the value of the infrastructure. It's a bit like, transit-oriented development, and you're saying we're putting in this infrastructure, what is going to be the value of that land around that new transport infrastructure that we can then capture to amortize the investment in the infrastructure. So we should be able to say there's a price tag you can put on it. So similarly at Sydney Olympic Park, we could value capture the investment put in the infrastructure, which in this case was particularly green infrastructure, and then that was put into the land costs. And also we put in the cost for future infrastructure because we knew we were going to add much more density than had been planned for in the original master plan.
I think in this context,
I think you're right. It must be hedonistic, but I think the key is that it seems to me that you had some kind of a cost curve. So if you do more green infrastructure, the discovered value is more. Something that has to be at the heart of the model. But I think we've never done.
In fact, I should add that in the morning I was moderating a session where your colleague, Mr. Petit, Professor Petit, was there. He talked about the digital analytics, the data analytics lab. So they've developed a tool which is really fascinating because it's got a number of different indicators, I think more than 10 indicators which are related to both quality of life or relational indicators as well, proximity to transport and so on. And they've developed a tool which is an online kind of tool. So you can actually do dynamic scenario analysis of what kind of value is being generated, what with relation.
That one's actually very
amazing.
It's very interactive. So you can say, well, what would be the value of green infrastructure? And then, so basically, you can look at the uplift that you can get in terms of development. So if you were a developer, you could say, well, if I invested in green infrastructure as opposed to transport infrastructure, what return on investment would I get? But it also, from a government planning point of view, they go, what value capture can we get back from the private sector in terms of zoning and uplift? So it works both ways. It's very transparent. You can see what are the benefits that flow to the community and the developer, but you can also see what the development potential is for that development, which can flow back to the state in terms of investment in public infrastructure. It's very,
I don't want to hog any more time, but does that mean that there needs to be a project of that magnitude and that kind of mixed use for it to make economic sense? And if you were trying to do smaller,
no, I think that this model can apply. It just is smaller, and maybe it might be a little community center. What if we put in a community center or a preschool? What would be the knock-on effects in terms of would more families housing congregate around that area? Would it mean less demand on the roads because it's in a residential neighborhood? I mean, that you can put in very different parameters to see what the benefit, because benefits aren't just cost, they're social cost or economic cost or environmental cost. So it's complex modeling.
But even public health impacts can be quantified if you have an evolved enough framework.
The great thing now, of course, is that you have large amounts of data available and the artificial intelligence to be able to manipulate. So I think today's economic modeling of urban areas is very different from, I guess, what we did as students.
And even when I did that at Sydney Olympic Park, we didn't have those sorts of modelling. It was all just done with spreadsheets and putting in lots of numbers. And what about if we change this number or that number? So it's been very rapid. But I think also not only the ability to model, but the ability to visualize, to see what the impacts of those different parameters will do. So you can see whether to have this sort of investment, you're going to have this much development. If you want to have this much development, well, you're not going to get that much infrastructure, public infrastructure, in return. So, it's enabling decision making to be based on evidence, but also priorities. So values can be embedded in that sort of decision making as well about what's important.
We have another question here, and another. Shall we hear both the questions and then perhaps I'll request for an answer. Please go ahead.
Hello, ma'am. So you talked a little bit about urban farming. If you could just talk a bit about how, I mean, did it really have a significant impact, maybe in terms of environmental effects or livelihoods or whatever? I mean, if you could just explain a bit more how it.
So that was a specific project that we did for one of the outer western councils who had this problem with the costs of maintaining all this open space, which was basically where you dump cars or throw your waste, or people get mugged, or or road verges and the like. So they said it cost, I can't remember how many millions of dollars a year it was costing, just even in mowing the grass or surveilling these spaces or cleaning up the rubbish. And so it was very much a propositional approach about how else could this land be used. So we looked, some of this land which we have put suburban sprawl on is really the most fertile agricultural land. It's just ridiculous that we're actually building on it. We should be, densifying the city and keeping that farmland for what it's really good for. It doesn't make sense. So from our point of view, it was an opportunistic way of saying we can capture some of that land back in a micro way. But we also have urban farms and market gardens within the urban footprint, along the waterways in the flood-prone land. And now a lot of those market gardens have been zoned in so that they're protected. So, obviously Open Pressure would say, we could just fill in the floodplain and develop on it. But now it's actually been recognised as being of high value because the amount of productivity in this and the proximity to the market. So that's already in the inner areas, but in this outer western area, the demand is just. So this was our political statement of going, and it could not only, it's not just about environmental values, but it also can be for productivity and food. Yep.
Namaskar. I have a question to all of you, to the members who are sitting in the chairs. So, what type of motivation and financing should be given to the architects, engineer, and the professionals, so that they can develop sustainably a more green city, a sustainable city? What type of motivation should be given, and what type of financing should be required to make all those things should be possible? A sustainable city should be possible. So this is my question.
Do you mean in terms of developing capacity, or
what are the things?
Or to engage all these professionals?
Yeah. Engage all these professionals and everything.
Well, I think there's two levers. There's carrots and sticks. So, for example, in Australia, they wanted to encourage the use of solar energy, so they gave a rebate. So if you instituted solar panels, then you would get a rebate. This is at a sort of residential level. And so it fed the market. The market grew, the cost of solar came down, and then they actually took away the incentive, because now solar was affordable. And so now there's a take-up rate of solar energy because the market has now actually come to meet the demand. The other way of doing it is through sticks, which is through regulation and control, and saying mandate that you must use, you must not include 400 million cars in your development. You must achieve this sort of rating. We have a NATHERS rating, which is in the National Building Standard. We have BASIX, which is in the state building standard, about what level of sustainability you need to include in your development, from things like materials, thermal comfort, etc., etc. So I think there are different ways of getting people on board. Either you give them a carrot, or you give them a stick, and you use both of them depending on the situation.
Okay, we'll just take that, and I think that will be the last question. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, good evening. I am Sandeep Chauhan. At the moment, I'm wearing a hat of an organization called Sea Ganga, which we have created under National Mission for Clean Ganga, which is like a think tank, right? So I also I do practice smart city consulting. So I would like to know one thing. Since we're talking about water, right? So I have a comment and then a question as well, ma'am. One is that as far as energy and transportation, etc., in smart, sustainable cities, it's been more or less planned and taken care of. But water somehow has slipped through in this part of the world. And with climate change across the world, sustainability, it has become almost existential. And maybe in 10 years' time, India might see it might be a national security issue. But somehow it gets, it is put in a corner and we find some solutions. Even in Australia, your Murray-Darling Basin, right, and many others. So why is that water not popping up as a red sort of a light while planning sustainable cities? Although we talk about it, but still somehow we are, putting it under the carpet. So that's my question.
You know, and this is as much a personal view as a professional view. I think it's because we treat water as infrastructure as opposed to something which is a life source. And it's fundamental as oxygen to breathe. And if we don't actually treat it as something as sacred as that, and we just treat it as some, infrastructure, we've got to put it, I mean, the fact that we create pipes and stormwater drains, we immediately turn them into the backside, something that we don't want to see, rather than bringing it to the front and celebrating it. And you see it in India as much as in Australia. And so it was interesting in part of the metropolitan strategy where Sydney Water, that obviously manages all the water infrastructure across the city, felt that they had been marginalized in the process because they see water as being fundamental to the planning of the city, because often we don't plan on water catchment lines or drainage lines, which are so obvious if you want to plan sustainably. And the Regional Plan Association is a great advocate for water catchment planning. But it's because we put them in drains and you don't know where the water is. It's not where it used to be. Like, when I showed you that project and we actually planted the original line of the creek, which was quite not even connected to the original stormwater drain. So we're so disconnected from the natural system. Sydney Water actually supported the research on our heat mitigation done by Matt Santamuris, because they wanted to demonstrate how intrinsically important the water systems were to solving some of these challenges, such as heat islands. So they're very much coming to the front and centre in metropolitan planning, but they've come in through the back door, and I think that's very interesting that they have been marginalised. But I think that's my view, is because we see it as something that you put under the ground rather than celebrate and acknowledge for what it really needs to be.
Thank you. I think I should draw this to a close. And on the positives, it's not all bleak in India, I have to say, so that you don't take away a vision of a sort of futile urbanization and urbanism.
But it's
in
not
India.
all good in Sydney either.
Yeah. So, well, I'd certainly like to say that out of 100 smart cities, there are a large number of them, for instance, to address the water issue. Guwahati, Coimbatore, cities around the country that have chosen a pathway to becoming smart, which is about managing water, for instance, and through all the principles that you talked about. So I think what has been fascinating in India has been, over the last 4 to 5 years, there's just the steep learning curve of learning from global good practice and examples. And of course, we are the good thing is that every new lecture is a new set of ideas, which is wonderful. And thank you very much for enriching our thinking on this, especially with a few takeaways, which I'd love everybody, because they were catchy and important to keep in mind. One, of course, was the city as a laboratory. It's just the living lab concept is not something that comes easily to our minds, because we think of cities in such a fixed kind of way. They're very solidified, and they're very sort of, they tend to be more stagnant in our imagination rather than alive to possibilities. And very importantly, thank you for pointing out, business as usual is not an option. I think that's one key takeaway that we should have. Also, the ideas about multifunctional infrastructure, the idea of high performance built environments, the importance of design is fundamental to this. Although you didn't speak about design, but it was embedded in the argument, which is that everything actually every detail, as they say, God is in the details, and every single detail needs to be looked at. And then these, I think the number of examples you shared with us, which was really enriching to see the practical manifestation of these approaches. And ultimately all of this, and perhaps, you know, we can hope to have another lecture where you could come and speak to us about the spatial inequity issue, which you pointed out, and I think that's fundamental to our problem at the moment, which is the divisions within cities and their sort of ghettoized cities, and therefore policy and action are both clouded within that. But having said that, this was delightful. Thank you very much, Professor Lockheed, and thank you, Dr. Mathur, for joining us for this, and the audience. Thank you. Wonderful.